thank you for tuning in to All Bodies Outside. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Peterson. On this episode, our guest is Van Ethan Levy. They are the author of a book titled Exploring My Identities. For those of you joining via video, here's the cover of their book. Also, Van is duly licensed as a marriage and family therapist and is a licensed professional clinical counselor. Van's identity is trans and a non-binary person, and their pronouns are they, and for Spanish speakers, ella. They were socialized as a female, are autistic, and have dynamic disabilities amongst many more historically excluded identities. You can check out more info about Van at vanethanlevy.com, and I'll spell that out. That is VANETHANLEVY.com. In today's episode, we'll discuss the low sense of belonging and safety within outdoor spaces for trans populations and strategies for overcoming this disparity. During this conversation, we'll also focus on queerness. Queerness refers to a general deconstruction of heteronormative, hegemonic culture and is a term that is a more biologically accurate way of acknowledging variance and fluidity of gender, sexuality, and expression. This is important because a person's identity is core to how the individual experiences leisure in outdoor spaces. Lastly, keep in mind that compounded discrimination commonly occurs for individuals who have two or more identities that are historically and currently excluded and erased. Van, thanks for joining us and great to see you.
You too. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to see you.
Yeah. It's been almost 2 decades since we've seen each other in person. I guess it's been 2 decades since we've seen each other in person and video. It's been a while. So you've been up to a lot of good work. I was checking out your website before this episode, and I was amazed at everything that you're doing. So would you mind describing what you've been up to, the activism that you've been doing?
Oh, wow. It's been a lot. Essentially coming into the mental health field after being on the other side of it, experiencing a lot of conversion camp and conversion therapy since probably as early as maybe 5 years old, I thought that we would be a lot more advanced than we are now. And when I saw how much transphobia and gatekeeping currently existed, I started reaching out to local mental health providers in San Diego to find out who could do letters and assessments for our community in just one session, and realized there was almost nobody. So from that point on, I made it a mission to be able to find providers in every single state, which is how I started my No More Gatekeeping project, which now I have at least one person in every state. Some states I think I have over 100 providers, which then turned into every time I was marketing it on Facebook and Therapy Spaces, I was getting so much transphobic comments and responses that I decided to just put on a workshop to give a 1-hour training how to do it, and then recorded it. So now every week I would say at least 15 to 20 people take that recorded trainings with the letter templates, which that kind of expanded more into how do we deconstruct gender? How do we look at it from that it's just a social construct? How do we create safer spaces for ourselves and others? Also, during the pandemic, I started to see a lot of clients who were needing therapy but couldn't afford it, and I couldn't afford to take on 50, 60, 70 people at $0 to $5 per person. It wasn't sustainable, both emotionally and financially. So that's when I kind of put together the workbook that you shared, and it's designed both for our allies and cis people as well as for people in our community. That is probably the equivalent of 1 to 5 years of therapy of exploring who we are as well as deconstructing the societal constructs of gender so we can create those safer spaces for ourselves and for others. Because a lot of even cis people don't realize how much we're limited within our own identity based on what we've learned. For example, maybe there's a boy who wants to do ballet but can't because it's only for quote unquote girls, when the reality is it has nothing to do with gender or identity or genitals or anything. So those are a couple of the projects. And then I realized even organizations like WPATH, which dictate the care that we're supposed to receive and the standards as to how we can get access to what we need to affirm who we are, were mostly run by cisgendered people or binary trans people, especially able-bodied, neurotypical, white or white passing, who were providing a lot of information that's actually pretty violent and harmful to our community. So that's when I decided to put on the first ever international conference where every single person involved and or presenter is somebody who's not cisgendered, and in addition paid them, because one thing that people don't realize is that in the US, the average yearly salary for our community is only $10,000. And we're constantly invited to the table to be tokenized and engage in free emotional labor, yet discarded at any point when we're disagreeing with what everybody else who isn't even part of our community believes how we should be engaged with, as well as not even compensated. So that's kind of how the conference came about. I also recently just developed, and we're about to have it be live, an app for medical and mental health providers that provide trauma-informed questions that you type in the responses, and then it populates a letter so that a trans, non-binary, and or another identity can gain access to medical care, whether it's surgery, hormones, procedures, whatever it might be. So it can kind of standardize the care, but also expedite it. Because currently right now, I can't change the laws about needing a letter for these kind of services, but I can hopefully help break down the barrier so it's done in a 50-minute session versus forcing people to engage in therapy for years. I'm trying to think what other projects. I have so many projects that I'm constantly like developing and implementing, or even the documentary. So I created a documentary over the pandemic as well, where I had, I believe, 8 different trans and non-binary people. And I asked them to share 2 stories, 5 minutes each. One of the most affirmed they've ever been in their identity, as well as some of the more violent experiences they've had, to give people a reality of what it's like to exist in our bodies and to go through just even like a day as a trans and non-binary person, to show that the most basic thing of having somebody use our pronouns or use our name is the most elated that we feel, and it's not asking others to do a lot. Whereas literally just existing comes with sexual violence, physical violence, no access to food, housing, money, all the above. And it had some call to actions as to what people can do. That's the bare minimum. It doesn't even hurt you, so that our community can have a bit more safety in this world. A couple other things that I've been working on and implementing as well is creating, so as a therapist, you need between 3,000 to 4,000 hours where you're supervised by a licensed therapist. So I'm really focusing on supervising people who are trans and non-binary, because I have yet to meet somebody who's gone through the process who hasn't experienced a lot of transphobia in the different sites that they're in. And in addition to it, we have to do these hours for free majority of the time. So imagine giving your time for free to give therapy, but also enduring transphobic abuse in your workspace. So there's a lot of burnout, which makes it a lot harder to find therapists who are part of the community. So I'm really trying to find ways to address the harm by being like on the DEI board of how we can make some of these changes to make it safer, but then also being a supervisor to those to hopefully create a little bit of a safer space for them to be able to gain access to their hours. So I know I have more, but that's all I can think of, and I'm out of breath.
Man, that is very impressive with everything that you're up to. I'm proud of you. You're doing a lot of good work out there, and that is wonderful. I think you brought up a lot of great points there with some basic things that people can do. Also, preventing tokenization. And I think that, everything that you said transfers over into outdoor spaces and leisure and outdoor spaces. And so I'm sure you're a person that loves to get outside and enjoy nature, whether it's taking small walks or going birding or whatever it is. And so what types of observations have you made when you're out in outdoor spaces?
In terms of around like my safety with my identity or?
Yes.
So most of the time I don't even go out. It can sometimes be debilitating, even the thought of having to leave my home, because 100% of the time, the moment that I'm going to interact with somebody, they're going to misgender me right off the bat. They're going to call me sir. They're going to use he, him pronouns, whatever it might be. So then I have a choice. Do I address it or do I not? And if I don't address it, I'm communicating to myself that I'm not worthy of existing. I'm not worthy of showing up for myself. But if I do address it, most likely I'm then going to have to slip into a position of arguing my reality or defending it or educating it or looking at somebody looking at me like I'm weird or hearing things, well, then what are you? or violence, which is a reality. And so, especially being in outdoor spaces like in nature is even more terrifying because there's not a car for me to jump into to drive away in, or there's not a space that I can run and hide. I'm literally just out in the middle of nowhere in too much openness. And so I've never even really been camping. The closest thing to camping, because I really want to go camping, was I had a house with a backyard, and I went out last year. I'm not in that place anymore, just so I can experience what it felt like camping. And it was like a concrete slab that I bought a tent to put on. And all night, all you heard, because it was in the city, was like ambulances and stuff. So it's the complete opposite of what I imagine camping truly is. So that it is a major deterrent for me to go out. And then a lot of things people don't realize too is, where am I going to use the restroom? If I go to the restroom and somebody potentially sees my genitals, they're not matching to what they believe that they should be, or how they perceive me to be, what might that lead to? I believe it's like 1 in 2 trans people experience sexual violence before 18, let alone like after 18. So like even talking about it, like my heart's racing, my body is shaking. Just the like pure panic of existing in the world that we're in as a trans and non-binary person, and the thought of being so exposed. And then let's say that nothing happens at all. I don't think my body would ever even be able to settle to enjoy the experience, just in the like pure fear and anticipation that something might happen.
And that sounds very exhausting. And I can't believe that, you mentioned that statistic of 1 in 2 trans people face violence by the time they're 18. That's horrific. That's horrific. And I know that you mentioned that you can feel your pulse up, your heart rate going. And so I did want to, say thank you for being vulnerable and sharing those things. That's something that does take a lot of courage. But gosh, like going out into these public spaces, you don't, as you mentioned, having to maybe ignore your identity, which you don't want to do, or get into, possibly an argumentative situation. And it's like, I don't have the energy for that every single time I go out. And rarely do I have the energy for that. That just sounds exhausting. And gosh, like I feel so bad that, it's exhausting to the point that you don't even want to leave your place, and you don't want to go out to these cherished places. And you're out in the San Diego area, which has access to a lot of great nature, whether it's to the west on the coastline, or to the east in the mountains, or the Sierra Nevada mountains, to the north, Yosemite National Park. And I would love to be able to help create a higher sense of belonging and safety in these spaces, so that you could get out and enjoy them and receive those benefits of being in nature. There's a lot of scientific documentation of mental health benefits of being out in nature. And there's also, the physical health benefits of just getting out and moving around and being in sunlight and whatnot. So what are some things let's start with the basic things. What are some basic things that you'd like to see out there that really help you be able to get out into these spaces?
That's such a big question, because it's like, sure, there's answers, but then I always have the like how it wouldn't work. It would just be nice to know that, like, even like consent, right? So having like some kind of unspoken rule that, like, if you see others, asking for consent if they want to engage, like, hey, good to see you. Do you want to connect and talk, right? Or because then that like gives maybe like somebody like me who could just say, actually, I don't, but thank you, and not be perceived as rude or anything, but just because I don't want to potentially waste my capacity of having an argument when we're just doing the basic introductions. And I say like, hey, I'm Van and my pronouns are they, for that to then become an issue, or when we're engaging, being misgendered or being referred to by something that isn't my identity. So I think like something that could be relatively easy to implement is highs and hellos are great, but for further conversations, just asking for consent if the person wants to engage, which I also think hits on different levels and more than just one's trans non-binary identity. It also hits on ableism as well. So maybe you're engaging with somebody who has sensory issues, or somebody who can't speak or who can't hear, or who is extremely COVID cautious and doesn't want somebody to be close to them. So it can potentially create even more safety for all different identities, so that everybody has the right to share if they want that connection or not with somebody who they don't know is a safe person.
Yeah, I think that is a fantastic explanation, Van. And I like that, this is broader than just for trans populations, as you mentioned, asking for consent when you want to engage and maybe just have a quick informal conversation. I think that is a wonderful idea. And I also like that you pointed out that, this works for all sorts of people and ableism. And, maybe there's people that do have maybe an auditory disability where it might be tough to engage and whatnot. And people assume otherwise, which isn't fair at all. So what are some other strategies that, just quickly come to mind for you?
Some other things that come to mind too is like, even if, let's say that you had to, like, I know a lot of spaces you need to get a pass or permission or a permit. I don't have the exact language, but essentially you're going to have to interact with a human at some point, even if it's online. A lot of their like forms ask male, female, other. And most people I know don't want to be an other, right? I'm not these two, so I must be an other. So if you're needing to know someone's identity, literally just asking identity and leaving it blank for people to fill in. Or like, why do we need to know? Like, what is the purpose? Some people would argue, oh, it's for statistics or so that we know what you look like, right? And that, like, knowing what you look like is inherently transphobic because it's communicating that if I mark female that I have to look a certain way, or if I mark male, I have to look a certain way, or non-binary, or whatever the identity is. So I think creating systems that are inquiring information in a way that isn't oppressive and harmful. So having kind of more trauma-informed questions, training the staff. I think they might be called rangers or whoever might be working in the space where you're entering into, implementing more training of how to not use gendered language. So many times am I met with, hey guys, right? Like, and people justify, oh, well, it's a gender neutral term. The reality is it's not. Just because we use it that way doesn't mean that it is. If there's restrooms, having gender neutral restrooms or single stalls. Trying to think what else that's coming to mind.
Okay, I got something. I just had a big mental kind of just epiphany, and it is the way that we approach research a lot of times. It just hit me in the head of how exclusionary it is. So going back to, we often are, in my field of research, using social psychology approaches to understand people's experiences in parks and protected areas. And one of the best ways to understand those experiences is surveys. Surveys always go through a slew of questions and then finish with the typical traditional U.S. Census Bureau of demographic questions. And it says, it's gotten revised to being male, female, or other. Who wants to put other? I wouldn't want to. And then I thought your explanation of identity in a blank box, let somebody fill it in. But then your further explanation of like, why does it even matter? And that is what got me thinking. There's so many times where it's just not right. Like, we will break up so say I pass out a bunch of GPS data loggers to everyone that's visiting Yosemite National Park to see where they go in Yosemite National Park. And then when they're leaving Yosemite National Park, I'll have them fill out a survey, and I will couple that survey information with where they went in the park. And then when we are producing maps for reports, we'll break that up binarily into male and female. And it's like, what good does that have? Like, I don't get and it's a traditional thing that is not right. And so your explanation right now just hit me in the head. And so I really appreciate you giving that explanation, because that's going to change the way that I do research. And I never thought about that until you gave your explanation. So thanks for giving that explanation. I'm sorry that I interrupted you in that, but I had that epiphany there. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And it brings me to something that I do think is important that people know that I think most of the time don't think about, is that a lot of questions that we're asking people, especially trans and non-binary people, are actually sexual violence. So if we think about, most of the time people say, well, what were you before? What were you born as? We're literally asking, what genitals did the doctor see when you were born? Because that's what people are equating to gender. They're not doing chromosome tests. They're not doing biological, that they're literally not looking at anything other than genitals. Or if they ask like what you are, like it's literally all comes down to that. And so a lot of the time they might argue, oh, well, we're wanting to know who do we have less engagement from so that we can maybe target and make it safer for that population. But if you're within the binary of male, female, you're literally saying that we don't care about anybody. And I don't mean you. I mean like when you really break it down, is that we only are caring about male, female. We're not caring about how to make it safer for everybody.
Yeah. And something that I think a lot of people don't think about. This safety aspect it goes so far, and I think your recommendations were fantastic with restrooms, different types of trainings. I think it's something that is very, very important going forward, and very important with looking at how I do research. I research how visitors interact and behave at parks and protected areas, and so I think it's just great what you are talking about. So going forward, there are in the introduction, I mentioned queerness and queering the outdoors. And I think that is a very important topic to queer the outdoors. And I wanted to kind of focus on why is that important? Why do you think that's important to queering the outdoors?
I think there's so many levels to it. Like if we even think back to pre-colonization, like the folks who literally existed before us, people who were native to the land, at least my understanding, and I can't speak for every single tribe that existed, but there were a lot less boundaries around gender and binary and heterosexuality. And so we've literally taken what exists that doesn't have, I'm going all over the place because my mind has so many thoughts right now. If we even look at nature in and of itself, like animals, insects, all the creatures that exist in nature, there is heterosexuality and binary, and quote unquote cisgender, but they're also within those same animals and insects also have queerness, have non-binary, have animals who can change their sexes, who have homosexual relationships or bisexual relationships, or things that all fall in within the queer umbrella. And then we're taking our existence into overtaking their space and saying, actually, it has to be within these heteronormative boundaries and these binary boundaries. And so it's literally disrespecting what used to exist. And queering spaces in general should happen, because if we're saying that the outdoors is for all people and queer people are part of all people, then why would we not make it that it's encompassing all identities and not just heterosexual, binary, cisgendered folks?
Yeah, that's great. I think it's important to, as I mentioned in the introduction, deconstruct that heteronormative, hegemonic culture, which is just founded on societal constructs, as you just mentioned. I remember reading a book by the author, Alan, I think it's Alan Watts. He writes comic books, and he's written quite a bunch, but he wrote one called Mirror of Love, and he talked about how he went all the way back to about 12th century and where a lot of these social constructs began. And he actually pinpointed homosexuality was not that it was, homosexuality had been around forever, but it was St. Paul in the 12th century or 13th century that then started saying, we're going to construct it as bad. And this is how we're going to socially construct gender and identity. And it blows my mind, as you mentioned, all these different types of identities and sexuality are out there in nature. And humans have been limited by these constructs, simple constructs that have done so much damage, created so much unsafety, and precipitated so much violence. And now, it is time to break and deconstruct those constructs. So I think it's really powerful to be having these conversations to help deconstruct that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And oftentimes, if we think about queerness, we might think of it as synonymous with free and freedom, and same thing with nature, right? So why wouldn't the two go together? If we're going somewhere to be free, to experience and be present with no limitations of dictated rules of you have to take your shoes off, you have to put your shoes on, you have to wear a suit, you have to do this, versus I'm going to a space to just exist and be who I am, which is exactly what queerness is supposed to be. And then in addition to, we have very high mental health, very high impacts on our mental wellness within the queer community. And studies have shown that being in nature, seeing green, being out in the open can really increase one's mental health. So why, again, would we want to impact somebody who has the most impacts on mental wellness and prevent them from being able to access something that could be really helpful for them.
Absolutely, Van. Everyone has a right to have access to those benefits, and it's not right at all. And I also wanted to bring up something that I mentioned later in the introduction. That was individuals who have two or more identities that historically and currently are excluded or erased. And this is something that's a lot more common than is made out. So I feel like right now we've had kind of a one-dimensional type of conversation, just kind of focusing on trans, but there's oftentimes people have two or more identities that have been historically or currently excluded or erased. And that, how do we help that situation as well? Or is it pretty similar to the basic types of tenets that you discussed earlier?
Well, so because there's so many identities that it's not as simple. So for example, if we think about beaches, right? San Diego is known for really great beaches, yet how accessible is it if you're in a wheelchair? Right? Like, it's very simple to put a wheelchair mat that can lead you to the ocean. I'm sure that there is budgeting that can happen for it, but we haven't done it. And what does that communicate? That we don't care about people with disabilities who can't access the beach in a wheelchair. And or for any other reason as to why they couldn't go from, call it the boardwalk, to the beach because of the sand. So really thinking about what's preventing people from accessing it. There are many beaches you go where you won't see anybody who is Black. And it's not because Black people don't go there or want to be there, but because it's not safe for them to exist there. Will the cops be called on them? Will they have to endure anti-Blackness and so much more? And so really the only true answer is speaking with the communities who are not accessing these spaces, and also holding that it's not a monolith. Me as a trans non-binary person, the reason I don't go into nature isn't going to 100% be applicable for everybody with my identity, and same thing with all the different identities, whether it's, and you can't even just say people with disabilities, right? We have to look at somebody who can walk, somebody who's in a wheelchair, somebody who can see, somebody who is blind. So even within these identities, what it looks like. So I'm a white passing person of color who's trans and non-binary. My reality is so much different than a Black person who is trans and non-binary. And so like there's so many like even videos where somebody's literally just watching birds existing as somebody who's Black and the police are being called, or somebody is threatening them or telling them that they shouldn't be there. And so the only way to really address these is to identify what currently exists and what is currently needed to kind of break down these barriers.
Yeah, Van, I think it's a great explanation in terms of the heterogeneous fashion within all these populations. And in the end, it seems like education is the way to go. It's something that's indirect. It's something that people can take at their own pace and, really help to form that allyship that's so important for, especially people that have two or more identities that have been excluded or erased. And so that education component is something that we try to preach a lot with parks and protected areas in terms of just conservation ethic. And it works pretty well for educating people. And I would love to see that heightened for people with multiple identities that have been excluded or erased. Another thing that I wanted to bring up, since you kind of brought up the example of, maybe some Black people at the beach wouldn't feel safe because they might have the cops call them. That has certainly happened many, many times. And to connect that, I wanted to ask about, for those of you that are viewing via video, I wanted to ask about if you could explain the flag that's behind you. I think probably a lot of viewers haven't seen that type of flag before, and I think it's a really healthy flag, and it includes the black stripe. It has the colors that, it has more colors in the rainbow that, we have traditionally put. And so I wanted to see if you'd be willing to explain the symbology behind the flag.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to quickly, before we move on though, I wanted to add one more thing about the conversation that we were having before, is that it's really important that we're looking at things systematically. So most of the time, the people in positions of power within the outdoors community are most often white passing, able-bodied, neurotypical, cisgendered, heterosexual folks. And looking at why there are no identities, what's the accessibility to get there? So I don't know the answer to that, but an example within the mental health field, the reason why you have a lot more of those identities is because, first of all, you got to go and you got to get your bachelor's. Then you got to get your master's. Then you have to dedicate almost, depending on the licensure, about 4,000 free unpaid hours, and then take all these tests. And the tests alone, I think, are over $1,000, and that's not including the study guide. And without the study guide, most people can't pass it because it's extremely hard. So who can do that, right? People in positions who have access to money. And a lot of the time, that's not people who have multiple identities that are historically and currently excluded in a race. And so I did want to speak to that really quick. But
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think that was a great way to sum up the privilege behind that. It takes a lot of privilege to go through that long trajectory and expensive trajectory and time consumptive trajectory. So that's important to point out.
Because a lot of the time you hear, well, it's not that we said that somebody who is black or somebody who's trans can't be here, but it's like, but what is the process to get there? How much transphobia do I have to experience? How much ableism do I have to experience? How much anti-blackness? And how burnt out am I going to be when I get there? And am I going to be kept here, or are they going to find ways to get rid of me? Right? They're not going to say, we don't want you here because you're trans and non-binary, but they're going to say things like, you're really difficult, so let me focus on, you were 1 minute late to work, let me write you up for that. Or I told you to call at 4 and you called at 3:59, right? There's so that they have documentation, paper trail to push people out.
I've never thought about it that way, how those are ways that people do create that documentation to push people out that they don't want there. And I never thought about it that way, and it's so true.
And a lot of the time it's people who their privilege prevents them from being aware of the harm that they're engaging in, and they'll justify it. Like, I'm not anti-black. This person was 5 minutes late. Okay. But if Brian was 5 minutes late, did you write Brian?
Right.
So why is it that you're holding standards for somebody else that you're not holding for everybody? But also even accommodations, right? Like, I have to navigate the world a lot harder than somebody who maybe is cisgendered and heterosexual navigating the world. So me going from my house to your work, and I'm a couple minutes, or not your work, my work, whatever it might be, and I'm 5 minutes late because I had to endure transphobia while I was pumping my gas, and then I had to sit just 5 minutes in the car so that when I come in, I'm not breaking down in tears and having a panic attack, right? So holding that space for, hey, you were 5 minutes late, can we have a couple minutes conversation so I can understand, to differentiate, I'm struggling with managing my time, or I just experienced something that was really horrific. In the future, I'm going to leave 15 minutes early so that I'm 10 minutes early and not 5 minutes late if an incident happens, right? There's not room for that help to navigate these barriers.
And that's so much to consider. I don't consider any of that. I just go to work. I don't have to deal with discrimination, and it's got to be something that that discrimination happens. You get to work, you're not in a mental state to work at that point if you just face that, and that's probably pretty common when that's occurring, or occurs pretty often. And I couldn't imagine then trying to be productive at work when the mental space is just completely diminished.
Yeah, I can't speak for others, but I'm going to assume it's relatively similar, is that we have to learn to override what we're experiencing. Even last week, I was pumping my gas. I had a mask on, and this guy, thankfully I had just put my gas and I just got in the car, is in my window threatening to kill me because I'm wearing a mask. They're like, I'm not asking anybody to wear a mask. I'm not telling anybody. I'm wearing it for my own safety because if I get COVID, I don't want to take that risk. I don't know what will happen. So I'm protecting myself, but it escalated this human being that I wasn't even interacting with. And then immediately 5-10 minutes later, I had to be on a work call, which I made on time, and compartmentalize this like pure terror of me and my little Prius, 5'2", and this person who was over 6 foot in like this big Denali, who was chasing me in his car afterwards.
Yeah, that's very traumatic. That's very traumatic, Dan. And I'm really sorry that, this is, one example of many. My gosh, it's, and then the mental fortitude and tenacity to compartmentalize and then try to ignore while then being at work and trying to fit into that culture. Despite that, there's possibility that part of that culture, there's people there that do not understand that these experiences, these traumatic experiences, are all too common.
And then a lot of us then will have to go from that experience directly into a workspace that is going to be just as unsafe, maybe not with the direct threats, but then whether it's the misgendering or the expectations of things that are beyond our actual abilities that our bodies can do. And so I just think it's really important that people are aware that there's so much more happening that we might not understand or even believe because it's so far from what we experience and the people we know in our lives. But a lot of the time, the people who are in our lives day to day are going to hold pretty similar identities to us. So it's not shocking that they've never experienced it themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you do all the activism you do. It was really amazing and inspiring to hear everything you did at the start of the episode. And I said, hey, Van, what have you been up to? You're doing quite a lot. And so I think that it's necessary, it's needed, and there's change needs to occur. And so I'm really proud of what you're doing. It's going to be helpful for society. It's going to have broad implications. So that's fantastic. Let's get back to the flag and discuss the symbology of the flag behind you.
Thank you. So I just kind of took a bunch of different things that currently exist, and then formulated it into what was representative of kind of more of my identities. And so down here is your typical trans flag, and up here is your non-binary flag that's typically reversed. It normally goes yellow, white, purple, black. But the intention of the positionality is most often, if you're a binary male in this world, trans, cisgendered, of course, but trans, you're most likely going to hold a heck of a lot more privilege than a person who is black and non-binary in this world. So I kind of wanted to depict that the people with privilege should be holding up and helping the rest of our community, which is why I did it this way. And again, I'm trans, I'm non-binary, which was the intention of these parts. This is actually funny enough in binary coding, which is what people use for computer coding, which is ones and zeros. And the ones I made a big circle, and the zeros I made small circles. And it reads from here this way, so left, so to represent how oftentimes a lot of, I believe it's Semitic cultures read from left to right, and then me being Jewish. And the infinity sign to represent being autistic, and then the different gradients of color to represent different potential sexualities, and being really intentional to have the black and brown circles on top again, because they're so often erased. A lot of the labor is put on BIPOC communities without any support of, cisgendered, white-passing, able-bodied folks. And I'm trying to remember if there's anything else. Oh, and this is actually, I think I didn't mention that, spells out the date of the conference, the month, date, and year in binary coding.
Man, that is really wonderful. And, I loved what you said earlier on where, the people of privilege should really be propping up the people without privilege. That is absolutely true. I wanted to ask, is that flag for sale on your website?
It's not. I need it to be. I literally went online and just said, make a flag, and then bought a couple for the conference to have hanging. I'd like to look further into it, and I also would like to get it more fleshed out and cleaned up. I really wanted the infinity sign to kind of be everywhere. So I'm actually working with a really awesome designer who's going to help me clean it up, and then eventually we'll hopefully have it for sale.
Nice. Well, you got to let me know when it's for sale. I'd love to purchase one. For your conference, is that occurring in 2023 as well? I think you said in 2022 that was the inaugural year of your conference.
So I haven't had any capacity just because I've been in survival mode. I've had a lot of transphobia within my housing and just a whole bunch of different, literally transphobia and ableism in a lot of different spaces. And I organized that conference alone. So it was a lot of work getting attorneys and websites and web designers. And I think we had over 14 presenters. So 2023, most likely no, but 2022 is recorded and available for sale for people to watch the recordings.
Great. Nice. Well, hopefully, planning a conference by yourself it's super time consumptive. It takes a long time, and maybe it's something that is hopefully you can do maybe biannually. So maybe 2024, because I think your conference is something that needs to stick around. It needs to happen on kind of a recurring basis. So maybe 2024 biannually would be really productive and cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely hope so because I really wanted to be intentional of like many things. One, making sure everybody was not cisgendered, making sure everyone was paid, but also making sure that I picked times based on what worked for others with different disabilities in different parts of the country and different parts of the world if they had children. And so figuring out in a like 8 hour day, 14 different people of when they're going to present that works best for them. Because we had somebody who was in Nairobi, we had somebody who was in Australia, we had somebody in New Zealand, and then the East Coast, Midwest. So it was like a lot of time constraints, and I'm really bad at conversions of time. So thankfully, I had a friend who's good at that to help.
Oh, good. That's a lot of time zone conversions and a lot of logistics to get all those presenters lined up and in sequential order. What a fantastic experience. So it was virtual. It can be, as you mentioned, purchased and downloaded off your website. Is that correct?
Yeah, and most of the stuff on my website's pretty easy to remember because it's whatever, it's vanethanlevy.com, which you spelled earlier. And so like for the conference, it's /conference, or if it's the book, /book, or /documentary. I try to make it like what it is as the / to make it a little easier to navigate.
Okay. Van, as we finish up our episode here, I wanted to conclude with hearing about some of your goals, your activism goals for maybe the next few years, things that you have on your mind that you'd like to accomplish that, would be societally beneficial.
So I'm really hoping to get because my book is an interactive workbook. And I'm really trying to get it into more spaces, especially into like elementary schools and high schools, and have it be part of maybe a more mandatory curriculum. Same thing with colleges, because if we're catching people when they're formulating their ideas to have something to combat what they're currently receiving. And also, again, like a statistic is 1 in 2 trans people will attempt to die by suicide before 18. Right? So hoping, and this in the CDC released that, which we know that they're relatively conservative, and they showed that number significantly decreases when people are affirmed in their identity, their names being used in their pronouns. So giving people a guide to help create these spaces for themselves and for others, but also even if they can't get that in their environment, potentially a book that can help them even just hold that I'm not quote unquote crazy or weird, or that there's nothing wrong with me. It's that I'm not living in an area that's supportive to who I am, or the people around me aren't getting it. So at the end of the big picture is how can I address transphobia, internalized transphobia that people hold in a bigger way. So implementing more trainings. I'm now in a position of power where I'm a clinical director of the Behavioral Health Services for Transgender Health and Wellness Center. So I literally run the entire mental health program, which opens up my ability to essentially force anybody who's a therapist there to address their internalized transphobia and to cultivate tools to be able to address it, to potentially help them be better therapists. Because for every one therapist that I can potentially make these shifts, that could be hundreds of clients that it's directly impacting. So that's one thing. I'm starting a nonprofit. It's still very much into the paperwork stage. I haven't even submitted it yet, which will hopefully help create spaces for trans and non-binary people to develop skills for jobs, as well as maybe have internships for therapists, as well as therapy, have resources, even like funding for them to be able to get letters, because therapists charge up to $400 or $500 just to write a letter for the person to get hormones and surgery. And again, when we reflect back on the average yearly salary of $10,000, why are you trying to monetize off a community that doesn't have it? And so maybe expanding into housing for our community. But let's say there was somebody in California who their teachers were refusing to use the name that they've shared. They could contact us and we can come in and do the advocacy work and provide the trainings and bring the awareness that needs to happen to kind of force that change so that it's a bit safer for that human being. So those are some of the bigger goals. And then this app thing, I really want it to make this care quicker so people can get what they need, and eventually, while on the other end, fighting the oppressive system to get rid of the need. A cisgendered person can go have breast implants, can go have their penis enlarged, can go have whatever electrolysis, and they don't need to be vetted by a mental health provider, yet our community does. So fighting on the end to eradicate that, and then also finding the loophole of how to expedite that process with the system that exists.
Wow, Van, that's wonderful. I feel like with all these different goals that you have and aspects of activism that you are getting after and doing, it's indirectly saving lives. You know, it's something that's really saving people's lives, and it's so much more saving a lot of people's, mental diminishment. It's helping them live a better life. It's boosting quality of life. Gosh, I love what you're doing. I love you. I wish I could give you a hug. Too bad it's virtual. But thank you for sharing all that. We're coming to the end here. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before we conclude?
I think a big thing is that always trust the person sharing with you, and holding that if we don't have an identity, that our opinion doesn't matter, our perspective, our whatever it might be. Oftentimes people might say, well, my trans friend doesn't feel this way. It doesn't matter if your trans friend doesn't feel that way. If this trans person is telling you that it's not okay, that we're really trusting the person who's trusting us enough to bring it to our attention. Because how hard is it to tell somebody that they're wrong, whether it's a close friend or a stranger, let alone when it directly impacts you? It's a big thing that I think is important that people understand, that no matter what identity that we hold or have, it doesn't prevent us from engaging in harm, even within our own community.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Van, thank you so much for joining All Bodies Outside. You have taught me a lot today, and I'm sure you've taught a lot of people out there. You know, as we mentioned, education is powerful. It can help save lives. And lastly, I wanted to also reiterate that I love you. I wish I can come give you a hug, and I'm just so proud of everything you're doing. For those of you listening out there, Van and I, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, we have known each other for a couple decades, and that actually goes back to when Van was in high school, or was it was high school, and I happened to be Van's teacher, and we had a great time together. I think we did Algebra 2 together.
Yeah, it was definitely math, and it was definitely when the school was in a shopping mall.
Yeah,
or a shopping center.
Well, I remember your mom was really gracious, and one morning said, "Hey, would you be able to do a lesson at the house if I were to make you all big old breakfast?" And so your mom cooked us breakfast, and I came over and taught at your house for the morning before I went over to the school, and that was something that I'll always cherish. It was a fun experience, and it was fun to be able to deliver education outside of the classroom in a more comfortable setting, and that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I would say that you, Christina, and Chris were one of my safer spaces and people. I didn't really get to have any spaces where people were using my name or using my pronouns, even in my own home. And so I used to always look forward to it. And I remember that day when I found out that I couldn't go into class, and then my mom said, or I think I had suggested, or maybe my mom, whoever, to make that offer. I was really excited because it was like I got to bring some of the safety that I really wanted in my home to be in my home.
Well, I really appreciate that. That makes me feel good. And hopefully Chris and Christina listen to this. I'll have to pass it to them because I know that will make them feel good. They both have just, largest hearts, and they're just fantastic people. So thanks for giving them a shout out because they deserve it.
Definitely. I love them so much. I'm still especially with Christina, I'm still in touch. And then Chris and I are Facebook friends.
Good. The next time that you do talk to Christina, let Christina know I said hello, and I'll have to send her a text sometime. I haven't caught up with her in a little while. And
I still need to find out why they called you Beeps.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it was, my initials BP and it turned into Beeps. And my name was constantly in transformation there, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, they always said Beeps, and I was like, where did that come from?
Oh my gosh. All right, Van. Well, I'm going to call it an episode. I'm going to throw on the outro music, and thank you so much. I'm just filled with gratitude that you were willing to come on to All Bodies Outside and deliver some great educational content. So thank you very much.
Thank you again.